Friends, all summer long we've heard from congregation members about how they have come face to face with God and experienced transformation. I love that image that God can take whatever sound we throw at God and make it beautiful and make it transformative. That story from Genesis says that when Jacob wrestled with God in the river Jabbok, he said he met God face to face. But it wasn't simple, it wasn't clean cut, it wasn't that beautiful tone from the French horn. It was a lot more like that spitty sound. Sometimes meeting God involves complicated feelings, difficult emotions, and a need to step away for prayer and perspective taking. Kathleen Vellenga will be addressing all of this in relation to a scripture reading that is familiar to most of us, I think, even if we aren't familiar with the Bible. It's been depicted often in movies and TV shows, but I think you'll find there's more to the story than we often hear. Kathleen has been a longtime member of Dayton Avenue Presbyterian Church and has been attending here at Mac Plymouth for the last 1.5 to 2 years or so. We are delighted she is here. Kathleen is a writer. I think you'll hear that come through clearly in her message today. We're delighted to hear from her preaching on this reading from the Gospel of Matthew. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time, the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning, he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased. May these words be to us our light and our life. Thanks be to God.
It's been very inspiring this summer to listen to all the face-to-face encounters, and it's helped me as a new participant in this congregation to get to know many of you. So I'm grateful for the privilege today. And the passage Corinne just read comes right after Jesus fed 5,000 people. He needed a break. And he not only needed a break from the 5,000, he needed a break from his disciples. So as he often did, he got away. He went up to the mountaintop and he prayed. And they sat in their boat all night wondering, where the heck did Jesus go? What's he done now? He's got us out here alone in a boat. And when a restored Jesus came toward them in the early dawn, the disciples perceived him as walking on water. I struggled with this story growing up. I grew up in the sandhills of western Nebraska where the Platte River was very shallow and we can walk on sandbars, but there was no discussion about the Sea of Galilee having sandbars. I got the alone part. And as I grew up, I learned to focus on the disciples' doubt and the disciples' need for faith. My family talked a lot about faith. We were told to show our faith through justice, righting the wrongs of others, taking care of other people. An early example for me, and very vivid, was as a child during World War II when Americans of Japanese descent were forced to leave their homes and come and work in an ammunitions depot near my hometown. My father showed his faith by starting an ecumenical church at the depot. And so as a young child, I met with and played with children who were, to me, a pretty version of the coarse depictions of the enemy Japs that my classmates drew on sidewalks. I found them very shy. It was later that I realized they were afraid, and much later that I realized they were angry. The angry God described in the Old Testament was someone my parents dismissed as how the Jews at that time, who were enslaved and wandering in the desert and angry themselves, perceived God. So we weren't talking about anger. If my parents disagreed, they talked in low tones and went to another room. If my sisters and I got mad, yelled, and even fought with each other, I was sent to be in the room alone. I didn't let on this was not punishment. I shared that room with my sisters. This is when I got it to myself. I could put my head under the pillow and cry and no one would know. I could daydream. I could read. I would take my punishment happily. When I grew up and was on my own, I learned to push my own anger down and focus on mending the injustices others suffered. As a young mother, I was personally involved with young people who lived in families who had generations of despair and rage, slavery, Jim Crow, discrimination, overt and subtle. We were loving to these young people, but their rage was deep. And we found ourselves going to the funerals of young people who'd been murdered. I was also, through a clinic that was established by Ramsey County at Dayton Avenue, became friends with young women with little children who were also living in households of anger. The first example of how dangerous this was when one of the women from clinic called me and said, "Kathleen, could I come stay with you and bring the kids for just a few days because my husband hurt me and he's gone and I just need a safe place and he'll never come to your neighborhood." Okay. We learned the desperate need for women's shelters when her husband called and threatened to bomb my house because I took away his wife. Another friend entrusted me with care of her then one-year-old baby while she recovered in the hospital for 3 months after her estranged husband shot her. Living with a traumatized toddler in our household of children and taking her every day to visit her mother in the hospital taught me searing lessons in anger, fear, resiliency, and friendship. When my friend reached across our cultural, ethnic divide to love me, I learned what friendship can be, and I could learn the depth of that divide. Her baby became my goddaughter and continues to be part of our family today. We knew that easy access to lethal weapons was necessary, but we also knew we had to work to change the generational problems of housing, lack of jobs, and health care. So, in addition to my personal connections, I also joined the League of Women Voters, as my mother had done, a nonpartisan, policy-oriented group. When I was asked to run in 1980 for an open seat as state representative in this neighborhood, it was very daunting. I did not perceive myself as a politically partisan person. But I began to see that this challenge would be a way that I could be effective in changing policies and funding priorities. Somehow, my family and I endured the tensions of a public campaign, and I was elected by a narrow majority. Now I found myself in work where that anger that I'd seen in other people was now directed at me from people of power instead of people of despair, people who were trying to hold on to their power. And I found that I was being often insulted with profane language And the women in the house, we were 25% women at that time, they and many of my male colleagues said, give it right back. Use the same words they use against. Show them you're tough enough. You can be as tough as the men. Let me add, there were only a few men that evidenced that kind of behavior. I could not do that. I knew it would inflame anger and exacerbate the divisive nature. Instead, I learned to push the anger down until, during that time in office, I learned a new way of praying. I constantly prayed. I even prayed with specific guys in mind that had insulted me, prayed that I would come to love them, but I couldn't figure out how God answered me. But Reverend Julie Nearest, who was an interim pastor at Dayton at the time, introduced me to something she called spiritual journey visioning. It was like being alone in a group. We were invited to close our eyes. Many of you have probably done this. Imagine yourself back in your childhood, which I guess is going back in your psyche. And Julie would give us a prompt like, be aware of God. When she said that, I usually felt a fatherly presence. My own dad was a gentle man of high convictions, and it was easy for me to think of God as my dad. But one week, when Julie said, be aware of God, here appeared this old woman standing on the rocky hills of western Nebraska, her hair streaming in the wind, her clothes blowing in the wind. And I just said, hello, God. Then Julie said, give your anger to God. She didn't say, describe it, analyze it, talk about it. She just said, feel your anger. And there it was, a hard ball right here. So in my mind, when she said, give your anger to God, I didn't question it. I just, in my mind, took that ball, threw it out, and the old woman caught it. And then she threw it up in the air, and in my mind, it broke into 1,000 pieces of light, and as the light floated down, I laughed and she laughed. I felt like I was floating. Later, I found Soren Kierkegaard's quote, no matter how long we lie there at 70,000 fathoms, he said, to be in the religious light is to float at 70,000 fathoms. And no how long we lie there, it does not mean that little by little we will reach land again. We can become quieter, sustain a sense of security, love jests, and have a merry mind, but we will never go back to the shallow waters again. It is a great thing to float at 70,000 fathoms with that faith and trust. It is a very little thing to wade in shallow waters with others. And that's where I found myself, was floating. Until I got back to work. My search for light was tested constantly, but I found that I could not do that floating up in the air vision in the middle of a public hearing or in a private caucus or even with someone in my office yelling at me. I had to put it on hold and float until I could be alone. I aimed for in my office with the door shut, or in the ladies' room, which you had to go out in a public hall to reach in those days, or behind a vending machine. I wept behind vending machines and let the anger out. Or at the end of the night, if my family was still awake, I could process it with them and then find my time alone. But often, during the worst times of session, I would get home at 4 in the morning and everyone would be asleep, and it was just God and me at home. I was also tested outside my work at this time when I learned that a young man who'd been in my Sunday school as a child was charged with murder. I was sad and I was furious. How could Michael kill another man? How could Michael do this to his mother, an inspiring woman whom I counted as a friend? But for his mother's sake only, I went to Ramsey County Jail to visit Michael. I'd been on many official tours of all the state prisons and the jail, which I was ushered in with ba-ba-ba respect, but I'd never gone through the humiliation of being a woman coming to see a man in jail without a clerical collar on my face. I talked to him through a phone with a wired glass. I alluded to the murder. He said, "That's life on the street." And I went out of there filled with more rage, but I gave it to God over and over. And over the next 10 years, while Michael was in Stillwater, I continued to visit him, and I saw a change. And his mother told me she saw a change too. He showed deep remorse for the family whose son had been murdered, for his own family. I stayed in office for 14 years. I was able to accomplish some goals, and others, like getting rid of the proliferation of military weapons. Didn't get that one done yet. We're still working on that. When I left office, my work continued as the director of a children's collaborative, where I was once again working with early children, as I'd done before I took office. But I also worked with neighborhoods and we find residual anger, stored anger, and overt anger wherever you go, and it was so helpful to me in that position of director of being able to find my peace. Today, I still volunteer for change, and I'm doing historical fiction. I find great satisfaction, but I continue to encounter loss and stress. Today, we live in a time when daily we face stress through the divisiveness of our national leaders and as many destructive isms as we can count. Some Sundays we come to church wanting a restorative calm. Some Sundays we come for church eager for action to right the injustice. Whichever way we come, we give it to God first. And God gives us back light, and we work for peace. Thank you.